For a little bit of change of pace from top 10s and reviews, I thought I'd have a go at a watch brand tier list. Before starting, I think it's worth quantifying what I mean by the tiers and how I've rationalised and approached this. I should say that obviously this is based on my current perception of these brands and is entirely subjective. I'll leave a link to the tier list I used in the description below if you want to have a go at this for yourself as a bit of a thought exercise to see if we overlap in any of our positions. I've labelled the categories from Grail A, B, C, D, E down to Hublot. I should say the default name on the list was Hublot, which is obviously a running joke in the community, but something I actually agree with, so I've left it alone. I'm not for a moment saying that I can afford watches from these brands, it's just an exercise in daydreaming, wishful thinking and window shopping. I'll just quickly break down what I mean by each of those categories, starting with Grail. So this is a watch brand that I admire, aspire to own or actually own in my collection, with a distinction being that there are multiple models from the brand that I'm interested in. Sitting just below that at A rank are brands that I also admire, but there are only singular models that I either want to own or do own already as part of my collection. At B, brands in this rank are ones that I respect, but simply aren't as high on my wish list. C are brands that, to be clear, I'm treating as neutral. I've nothing necessarily too bad to say about them, just not brands that currently excite me. D are brands that I've nothing against, but I'm not at all interested in and make at least one watch that I don't like. Down at E, here we're categorising brands that have multiple models that I really don't like. And at Hublot, I think hate is far too strong a word to use here because really I'm too chilled out for that and it's just watch brands after all, nothing too deep. Perhaps it's best to say that I'm just not a fan. Before we start, I'll just preface this with a couple of things. It isn't supposed to be taken too seriously, but I have found it to be a useful activity when it comes to considering where to look next to add to my collection. I'll say that I play it a bit fast and loose with the boundaries of the tiers. Hopefully I've explained where I've been flexible with that throughout and why, and I'll be the first to say that my knowledge on some brands is a lot stronger than on others, and I'm more than happy to have my mind changed in the comments below. Finally, before we start, I don't think I appreciated just how much editing would be involved with making something like this. I wasn't expecting the video to be anywhere near as long or time intensive to make as it turned out to be. With all that said though, let's get into the tier list. The 1815 Tourbillon Handwerkskunst from A. Lange & Söhne is my number one Grail watch with no exceptions. Outside of that though, it is really difficult to find any models from them that aren't absolutely stunning. The little Lange moon phase and the Zeitwerk are other real standouts to me. But the real thing I love most about the brand is the finishing on the movements. To my eye, there is no better. The only sad thing for me is to know that I'll never own one. As far as watchmaking content goes, there is something mesmerising about the brand introduction video on the Akrivia homepage. And I'd highly recommend a viewing if you haven't seen it before. There is a fine line between aesthetic beauty and something that is a little overdone and ostentatious, and I think Akrivia have a really nice balance between the two and land on the right side of that line. I'm also very fond of their Louis Vuitton collaboration. Of course, I respect AP as part of the Holy Trinity, but I've got to say that I'm not particularly taken with their modern lineup. 3 of their lines are just the Royal Oak, and 2 of those have been created with the design philosophy of more is more, which isn't something I tend to go for. However, given my love of Genta-inspired integrated sports watches, I'd be lying if I said a stainless steel Royal Oak doesn't appeal to me. I've nothing against Ball, as the C ranking hopefully indicates. At the same time though, they aren't currently making anything that I'm particularly interested in, though I do think the multicoloured tritium tubes create a cool aesthetic. I had a bit of a love-hate relationship with my MR01. The aesthetic, dimensions, finishing and movement were all so good, but I couldn't get over the rattle from the micro rotor. I'm still a big fan of the design language of the brand though, and I'd be surprised if I don't buy another from them at some point going forwards, as I did come very close to buying an Aquascaphe on a few occasions too. Similar in a sense to what I said about Ball with Baume & Mercier. Absolutely nothing against them as a brand, they just don't have any standout models that really grab my attention. Given my aforementioned love of integrated sports watches, you'd think the Riviera would be a strong shout for me, but it's a crowded market and I think cheaper competitors outshine it. I do like their Clifton Moonphase range, but not at its asking price. I really respect Bell & Ross for having their own very clearly defined design language. Their watches are immediately recognisable as a result. I'm ranking them down at C though, simply because it isn't a design language that particularly appeals to me personally. At the very highest end of what they produce, Blancpain makes some really interesting art-inspired pieces, but I don't think that they make for something that you'd ever consider wearing on a day-to-day basis. Beyond that, I feel like almost all of their collections are inspired in some way by the 50 Fathoms, which is just not a model that I'm overly enamoured with, and don't have much interest in the brand as a result. I have a lot of love for a Breguet numeral on a watch, and while I certainly appreciate the craftsmanship of Breguet as a brand, a lot of their models are skeletonized, and that isn't really something that particularly appeals to me, hence just a C ranking from my perspective. While I can see the appeal of a Breitling, for me the majority of their models are too busy and too big. Even the ones that I do like the look of would never fit me, so I never spend too much time looking their way. I'm not sure Bulgari get enough credit for their watchmaking prowess. The Octa Finissimo Ultra Thin is an extremely impressive technical achievement. I've ranked this brand low though because it simply doesn't make anything that I like. If I had a bigger wrist, I think there are a few Belova models that I would really like to own. I did try out the smallest iteration of the Devil Diver, but found that it was still too big for me. And I like the look of the GMTs in the Oceanographer range. I also like the Lunar Pilot, but again it would never fit unless my wrist decides to grow itself, which I'd say is highly unlikely. So to me, Belova is a bit of a forbidden fruit. I also like the idea of a vintage Accutron, but more of a collection piece than something to actually wear regularly. I can't stop buying Casios, to the point where I'm starting to wonder if it's a bit of a problem. The older vintage models give me such huge hits of nostalgia. I put one on and suddenly feel like I'm in Alien or Blade Runner. The modern octagonal models make me stupidly impulsive. I'm hoping to pick up an Oceanus when I visit Japan later in the year, and something irrational in me makes me definitely want a Mr. G B2100B 1ADR, despite its insane asking price. Nothing against Satina, as indicated by the C ranking, but I'm not a huge fan of their thin bezel models, and I think they are quite awkwardly placed in terms of the Swatch Group stable, generally offering slightly more expensive watches than Tissot, but with very similar movements. There are a couple of watches that they make that I like, but they're a little too big for me, so I think I'd be a lot more interested if these were scaled down. Chanel make one range of men's watches, which are so close to being really nice, but I feel like the font choice doesn't quite match the rest of the aesthetic perfectly. With nothing else to go on apart from some very steep prices, not a lot to interest me here, so I'm putting them in D rank. There are a few really nice LUC watches, but I don't know whether these are technically still part of the same Chopard brand. The other watch lines aren't really aimed at me, except for the Alpine Eagle, which I think is a really weak sports watch interpretation. I'm going to put them in C though, as the LUC stuff is heavily redeeming. Some games have a slash played feature in them, and similarly Steam tells you how much of your time you've divested into each game you play. I shudder to think how many hours, days, weeks, and in some cases years my totals would show. But in watch terms, Christopher Ward have been on fire in the last few years, and I think my viewing time on their website would be similarly worryingly high figure if I were able to see it. I'm absolutely in love with my silver lacquer dial Citizen. It's one of my favourite watches in my collection, and the only reason I've not put Citizen up to the Grail bracket is that so many of their best models are JDM only, and therefore really quite tricky to get hold of. Cradle watches are unbelievably simple to view from the front, and unbelievably complex to study from the back. I absolutely love them. They're only really down in B because, although I really do love these watches, they wouldn't be where I would actually spend my money. I didn't actually mention it when talking about Christopher Ward, but the 12 is one of my favourite watch models of all time, and I think it would be disingenuous not to recognise the impact that the Chapek Antarctique has had on that. However, I've got to say I prefer the 12. At the start of the video I was talking about models from Acrivia and how to my eye they managed to stay on the right side between luxurious and gaudy. I'm sure the craftsmanship on offer from De Bethune is similarly fantastic, but the designs fall on the wrong side of that line for me. I've come so close to buying a Doctor so many times. I really love the signature use of bright colours, but the truth is, like other brands hovering around the C rank, these watches are just too big for me. Abel only make one watch that is less than 42mm in size. This is it, and I'm not a fan, and the other watches they make are far too big for me, hence the low ranking. In terms of beautiful finishing, absolute top of the line horological complexity and a keen eye for aesthetics, colour and typography, F.P.Journe is right up there with Lange for me, with Lange just ahead thanks to individual models like the aforementioned Handwerkskunst. I'm not a fan of the fisheye tonneau looks of the Frank Muller collections. Definitely not a brand I'm interested in buying personally, but just because I don't like the looks doesn't mean I can't fully appreciate the quality on offer. The movements in particular are really impressive here. I'm bending my own tier descriptors a bit with Frédéric Constant because they do have a couple of models that I really like, with the High Life and their Moon Phase being really nice offerings. The problem is their price points. They're more expensive than other models I'm more interested in, so I end up never really looking their way as a result, leaving me less interested than I would be if they were more competitively priced. I really like the design of the casquette. It puts me in mind of Kit from Knight Rider or a Cylon helmet from Battlestar Galactica. It isn't a watch I'd actually go and buy with my own money though, hence the B ranking. I feel like there's a lot of overlap between what Glashütte are doing with their Pano and Senator lines with Lange, but given that the pricing structure is fairly similar, and I think the design language of the Lange models is slightly crisper, there's no way I'd go for this German brand over the other. Still have to really respect and admire the craftsmanship and design work though. I've made no secret of my love of textured dials, and Grand Seiko really do make some of the very best in the business. I've also made no secret of my longing to own a spring drive. I highly doubt I've got the finances to get both a textured dial and a spring drive in one watch without selling off everything else that I own, but one can always dream. For a very long time Grand Seiko were my favourite brand, and they're still right up there. There are some truly magnificent and appropriately expensive watches on offer from Grönefeld. Some, like the 1896 1Hz, with interesting designs that I could get on board with. But if I had the kind of money to afford a watch like Grönefeld, I would be spending it somewhere else. One thing I think the brand could really do with is the logo on the dial instead of the name. I think Hamilton, in all honesty, belongs higher up than being down in C tier. But having been stung with import taxes on buying one, then losing more money selling it on later on down the line, I really haven't looked their way much since. That's 100% a me issue that I need to get over though. I really quite like the Hermes H08. It's just too big for me, which is a common theme across their men's range. A shame, as there are quite a few interesting models that they actually produce. A lot of people will know H.Moser and C for their tongue-in-cheek models, particularly their Apple Watch spoof. What really appeals to me is the finishing of their movements, which maybe goes a little under the radar comparatively. The model that appeals to me the most combines so much of what I love about horology. It's lime green, my favourite colour, its dial is textured, and its movement beautiful. Maybe the most obvious ranking ever, but I have to say I'm really not a fan of Hublot. A lot of their models are far too big for me, far too expensive for me, not remotely original, and a lot are downright ugly. It's easy to look at when they were founded and say that they've got limited heritage. I don't really buy too heavily into that, I just don't like the watches that they make. Contrary to the tier I'm about to put them in, I do believe that Invicta actually makes some nice watches, but they are rare, and their brand strategy is to just throw everything at a wall and see what sticks. They make so many different models, and so many are laughably ugly. I do wonder if that's all a marketing ploy, but at any rate I would be surprised if there's any brand out there who are as prolific at making hideous watches. I really haven't got anything against IWC, but I never look that way as they're really quite expensive and there are many other cheaper brands that get a lot more of my attention. The ultra thin is great, the Reverso is a classic, and the Master Grand Tradition is extremely impressive given its small size. I also love their moonphase watches. Really, JLC could quite easily enjoy a position in the Grail tier for me, but the truth is I'd never pick a JLC over an F.P.Journe, a Lange, a Grand Seiko, etc. Hence the slightly lower placing. These are really nice watches, I'm not remotely trying to deny that, but they are also really expensive. And again, it's one of those cases where if I actually had the money to afford one, I'd be shopping elsewhere. As you'll have seen from my countless $1,000 and under lists that I've made recently, I have a budget that I tend to stick to. Longines are a brand that sit just beyond that, and the models I'd be interested in a little further beyond that still. I've heard nothing but good things about them, but until I've had some personal experience to go from, they aren't something that I get particularly excited about. I really like Louis Girard, and if the prices were cheaper, I'd almost certainly have tried one in my collection at this point. I particularly like the collaborations with Alain Silberstein, but these do not come cheap. Earlier this year, I came very, very close to buying a Manhattan. I was torn between the preferable sizing and the ultra-thin movement variants, and in the end didn't want to make a compromise and bought an F77 from Nevada Grenchen instead. If they ever release a 37mm ultra thin, I'll probably set a new record for money leaving my bank account. I really don't like the prices Maurice Lacroix have been trying to charge for their Icon Tide models. That's the reason for the low ranking here. I think it's an overpriced cash grab on the coattails of the success of the Moonswatch, if I'm being really honest. MB&F are a brand that are great to have a browse through every now and again to see what new interesting concepts they've dreamt up, but I wouldn't ever want to actually own one. Maybe I shouldn't, but I have a bit of a soft spot for the messy dial of the Ocean Star World Timer. But Mido have moved themselves up a bit recently for me, with their wave dials on the 39 and in particular the dimensions of the 36.5 Ocean Star model. Mont Blanc watches are alright, perhaps a little bit overpriced, but alright, but they just don't have anything in their range that really jumps out at me. Nothing overly offensive either there though, perhaps a bit vanilla, especially for the asking price. I would suggest that Nomos alongside Yema offer some of the best value for money movements when it comes to looks and finishing that money can buy. I've nearly pulled the trigger on buying one several times, but still have some reservations about those elongated lugs. Omega will always have a special place for me in any tier list, as they were effectively my genesis in horology. My vintage Seamaster was the first time I spent any real money on a watch, and it's what got me interested in the hobby. I recently added a Speedmaster Reduced to my collection, and that has only added to my love of the brand. I've lost count of how many videos I've watched in the past about the Bambino, particularly the new smaller variants, but I'm yet to bite the bullet. I wouldn't be surprised if they would move up as a result of some first-hand experience though. Nothing really jumps out at me about Oris. One thing I'm not a fan of is the lack of a brand logo. I just think it makes for some odd use of white space on some of their models. I do quite like their rectangular offerings, but for the price they're asking, they cost so much there's no reason I wouldn't buy a vintage Cartier tank instead and do it properly. Panerai are another brand where I have a lot of respect for the fact they have their own unique design language. You can always recognise a watch that they've made. I just personally don't really like them. For the price being asked for a Parmigiani, I would expect to really want one, with some eye-catching designs and unique features. Their watches are made from some very high-end materials with beautiful movements, but the designs are so forgettable, and where the logo is so narrow, the use of white space on the dial often feels really quite unbalanced and awkward. I feel like I'm doing Patek a bit dirty by saying this, but for me you could basically take most of what I said about AP and just replace Royal Oak with Nautilus. I do think that some of their Grand Complication models and vintage pieces put them a bit higher than AP, but not enough for them to be bumped up into A tier for me. Scrolling through the Piaget models for me is an exercise in proving that having money doesn't necessarily mean that you have taste. I was thinking D tier was a good place so that it was in line with other brands where I simply don't enjoy their design language. But then I saw the Tiger model with a £64,000 asking price, and now I really feel like E is a much better fit. Rado is basically this high because I really, and I mean really, like the 37mm Captain Cook models, with the exception of the Overpole, which is maybe a little too busy. I really like the dichotomy of it looking really big while actually being really small on wrist. Essence aren't the only watch brand that makes watches filled with oil to warp the dial perspective, but I do think they are the best at it. The fact that they've developed a very unique design language that's immediately recognisable as their own is also really impressive. I couldn't ever see this being a daily wear, but if I was a far wealthier man, I'd definitely want to own one in my collection. I didn't know a great deal about RGM before starting this video, so I went and did some research. Design wise, I think there are a few hits and a few misses in the collection, but the reason I've put them so low are most of the watches, even the ones I quite like the look of, are far too big for me to spend any time considering, let alone the asking prices. While I can definitely appreciate the engineering involved in producing movements that can withstand the use cases involved with some Richard-Mille models, I can't stand how their watches look. To me, they are extremely expensive Invictas, and that cost element puts them down into the Hublot category. Essentially, you can take what I've just said about Richard-Mille and apply that exact same logic to Roger Dubuis. They've taken the idea of more is more and ramped it up to almost Jacob & Co levels. Not for me at all. It's deeply ironic to me that one of my favourite watches, the Datejust, comes from one of my least favourite brands. I really don't like the false exclusivity, I don't like the AD system, I don't like a lot of the watches, and I feel like a lot of the releases in recent years are just duds, with the exception of the 1908. I love my Prospex, I love my Mojito, so Seiko were already going to rank highly for that reason alone. Outside of that though, I want a vintage tank model, I want more Presage models with textured dials, I love the Astron, I'd love a vintage spring drive, the list goes on, and I'm very much looking forward to visiting the Seiko Museum in Tokyo later this year. Until I made this channel, I spent an inordinate amount of time trawling through YouTube watch reviews myself. Now, I tend to steer clear of them just so that I hope I'm at least giving my own unique perspective on things for whatever that might be worth to you. I'm saying this because I have seen countless positive reviews of a variety of different models from Sin. They're only this low on my tier list because I have no personal experience with one, and some of their busier designs don't appeal to me. I do, however, really like the look of the 356 Anniversary Flieger Classic, so who knows, with more time and experience I can easily see them moving up. Much like Maurice Lacroix, I've put Tag this low mainly because of the disdain I have for their recent collaboration with Kith. While I know Tag have a backlog of pieces people will consider to be classics, none of their modern offerings really appeal to me either, though I will say the most recent edition of the Aqua Racer is definitely going in the right direction at least. I think Timex would have the potential to be even higher on this list for me if it weren't for the poor experiences I've had with their straps and bracelets. Obviously they've got a huge number of watch models on offer and not everything can be a hit, but their recent run of 70s and 80s inspired re-releases have been great. But they keep cheaping out on the bracelets. A shame, or they'd be at least a tier higher. There are plenty of Tissot models that I like, but as a brand I don't feel like they have a really obvious identity running through the watches they produce. Obviously that's always going to be a challenge when it comes to a company making this many watches. I did have a PRX, but it sat too proud on my wrist. I like the Sidereal range as well, but they're too expensive for what they are in my view. So nothing too bad, nothing too good, perhaps a bit bland. C rank for me. I hadn't heard of Trilobe at all until I started putting together this video, and what I found really impressed me. The style of the movements on offer put me in mind of Yema's manufacture calibers, but the time-telling creativity, finishing and materials involved have all been turned up a notch to reflect the higher price point. Some really nice pieces in the Trilobe collection, and definitely a nice place to stop for some wishful window shopping in future. Given what I've said about Rolex, you might think it was safe to assume that I wouldn't like Tudor either. However, the Black Bay 54 is my daily watch, and as it sits on my wrist while I write this, I really can't think of much I could do to improve it. I'm also a fan of the 1926, Pelagos 39 and the Ranger, so more than enough on offer here to meet my description for a Grail brand. They are far too big for me, so this might come across as hypocritical given what I've said about other brands, but I have a lot of time for the Freak range. I've tried one on, and they really are interesting experiences when it comes to time telling. They're unique, innovative, and fall into the category of I wouldn't wear it because it looks like a dinner plate on me, but if I were rich enough, I'd definitely want one in the collection to pull out and study. I like the fact that Unimatic watches are immediately recognisable as their own. It doesn't matter what style of watch it is, you can identify who made it and from quite some distance. That being said, it isn't a design style that immediately grabbed my attention, so I think C is a fair ranking for Unimatic for me. The final and oldest of the Holy Trinity, and you might have been expecting Vacheron to slip in alongside its contemporaries into B rank, but a couple of models from the Historique collection, the 222 and the 1921, are frankly a horological chef's kiss in my book. Love them both. Zenith are in that uncanny valley for me of being too expensive for me to ever own, but not expensive enough to fantasize about owning. That's always been my impression, at least. Looking over their collection for the video made me realise that actually they have some obscenely expensive models, so maybe I need to reevaluate a little here. Until I do, I'm putting them in C tier. Finally, we arrive at the last brand, Zodiac. I'm a big fan of the Super Seawolf and own one until recently. After dimensions and texture, colour is next up on my hierarchy of considerations. And if I can find an aquamarine dream at a cheap enough price, I'll definitely be getting a Seawolf back into my collection again. I'm just going to take a moment to do some reordering of the Grails from left to right in terms of where I'd rank them. I'm only going to do that for the Grail watches though, or I'd be here all day long. Now that I'm here, I'm thinking about the Washi dial models from Citizen, and I'm going to move them up on that basis. I'm not entirely sure how I managed to miss out Cartier from the discussion earlier, and now that I've realised my mistake, I'm not sure why I've only put them in A. I'm going to move them up to Grail for the Tank and the DeSantos ranges. They are essentially the go-to brand if you want a square watch. Well, there we have it. It's been an eye-opening experience for me. I don't think I've ever felt so out of my depth. It's good to get a reality check on just how little I know about horology every now and again. I completely underestimated how much research, comparison, evaluation and editing putting something like this together would take. I have nothing but respect for people who make content like this on the fly in one take or are brave enough to stream it. Hats off to you. I've drawn a line under my list here because I don't want to spend an eternity second guessing myself, and I already know if I went through and did it again, there are probably areas I would change. So let me know what you agree on, what you would change, what takes are good, what takes are bad, and what you think I've overlooked in the comments below. No one is going to agree when there are this many brands involved, so treat it as a learning experience for me and maybe for you. There are a few brands here that I feel very strongly about, but plenty of others I'm more than willing to have my mind changed with a good line of argument. Obviously, there are plenty of other brands who aren't included. Feel free to shout out where you think some of them would go. I left the list of brands as default from the tier list to push myself outside of my comfort boundary, but it did mean that there are a few brands I'm more familiar with that didn't feature. I do think making a video like this is perhaps a bit self-indulgent, but I did find it a useful experience collating my thoughts, so give it a go yourself and see what you learn from it. As ever, thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed what you've seen or found it in some way informative, drop the video a like and consider subscribing for more content like this.